Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a great day. Thank you so much for joining us at the Research and Scholarship Collaborative, our Lunch and Learn. We are really happy to join with Dr. Tara Ross, who is going to be presenting for us today on qualitative interviews. And I had a little sneak peek and it looks fantastic, and I'm sure you will all enjoy it. And I'm going to turn it over to her now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shoshana. I appreciate it so much. So today I get to talk about one of my favorite things in research, and that's the qualitative interview. I'm Tara Ross, and thank you for coming, or thank you for listening on the recording if you're doing that. I've been with Keiser University for 26 years, but I'm also an alumnus of the PhD program in educational leadership, and I graduated in 2013 with my doctorate. And since then, I've continued to teach for Keiser, but I've also conducted research with refugees in camps in Africa and the Middle East, and through various nonprofits, and as well as the UN. And I've coached quite a few doctoral students in the last dozen or so years in understanding how to use a qualitative methodology in their dissertations. So whether you're a graduate student starting your first research project, or maybe you're just starting your first methodology class, this session is for you. We're going to explore the how and why of qualitative interviewing, because it's an art as much as a science. We'll learn how to uncover the lived experiences behind the quantitative numbers. And at its core, qualitative research is about capturing stories, perspectives, and meaning, and things that statistics alone can't provide. So let's get started. Let's start with a simple question. Why use qualitative interviews in research? If we looked at data from a fictional study on workplace burnout, quantitative surveys might reveal that, say, 75% of people in a study report experiencing workplace burnout. But what does that really tell us? It gives us the what, but not the why. What factors contributed to that burnout, and how do individuals make sense of it? What emotions or struggles or personal experiences shaped their reality? And this is where qualitative interviews come in. So unlike quantitative methods that reveal trends, interviews allow us to go deeper, to hear real voices, capture lived experiences, and uncover the human stories behind the data. At the heart of qualitative research is storytelling, and stories are how we as humans make sense of the world. So long before we could write, we learned through spoken stories, passing down knowledge and emotions and experiences, and they help us to understand perspectives and form relationships and connect with others on a deeper level. In research, we focus a lot on gathering facts, but facts and numbers alone don't always tell us the full picture. So if we look at two people who report feeling stressed at work, their experiences of that stress might be entirely different. One might describe feeling isolated due to poor management, while another might talk about an overwhelming workload. The meaning behind their experience is what truly matters. And that's why qualitative interviews are so powerful. They don't just capture what someone thinks, they uncover how they arrived at those thoughts and why those experiences matter. Irving Seidman wrote one of my favorite books that I used in my doctoral program, so I'm going to reference him a few times in this presentation. But he's a leading scholar in qualitative research, and he shares it plainly. Most simply put, stories are a way of knowing. And think about it. When we ask our friend about their weekend, we don't just want a summary of events. We want to hear the details, the emotions, and the moments that really matter to them. And we want to understand how and why they experience those moments in a particular way. In qualitative research, interviews allow us to capture those personal stories in a way that gives voice to lived experiences. And this is one of the reasons I became so enamored by qualitative interviews because I like that it gave voice to people that many times don't have voice in society. By listening deeply, we gain insights that quantitative data alone could never reveal. So when people share their experiences, they aren't just listing events, they're constructing meaning. As Seidman explains, telling stories is essentially a meaning-making experience or process. This is what makes qualitative interviews so powerful. They don't just collect responses of people, we're not just asking people, we're not just reading off a survey, right? We're asking them questions and having a conversation with them, okay? So, doing data collection this way enables us to capture how people might organize their thoughts, interpret their experiences, and make sense of the world. And believe me, everybody from humanitarian workers to marketers on Fifth Avenue use qualitative interviews because they want to understand the psyche. They want to understand what people are thinking. So if someone describes losing their job, they might not just talk about the financial impact. They might frame it as a turning point in their life or a lesson in resilience or even a moment of personal growth. So when we allow people to tell their stories in their own words, we gain a deeper understanding of how experiences shape identity, especially. Identity is a big one, but also emotions and behavior. And it's show versus tell, right? Let's look at an example that's not from this fictional study on workplace burnout that I've been referencing, but rather is related to my study that I did as a doctoral student, which was on how resettled refugees acculturate to a new country, specifically the United States. And when we report on quantitative data, when we report on the numbers, we might share the following information. A recent survey found that 78% of refugees report feeling somewhat adjusted or fully adjusted to life in the new country within 5 years of their arrival. Okay. It's straightforward. It gives us the facts. It helps us to understand the trends. Data like this is critically important. But these are real human beings we're talking about here. And that is what interested me. I wanted to hear their stories, and understanding data is not the same as empathizing with their experience. So empathy can be the thing that tips, say, a policymaker into creating policy that is more humane. Let's look at the difference, okay? By contrast, here is an example of a resettled refugee telling her story. This was one of my participants recalling what normalcy in life would look like. When I was 16 when I arrived in the US, and all I really wanted to do was go to school because there were two things that meant normal life and meant everything was at peace and was okay. One was school. It means kids are going to school. It means parents are doing something and it's not affecting kids and everybody's in school. And number two was the airplanes that fly by and that are not bombing airplanes, but the actual commercial airlines. They leave those white tracks. Couldn't see them anywhere in Bosnia. Those two things, that's all I kind of wanted to see and have happen because it meant everything was okay. So here we get a visceral sense of the need for normalcy, and it becomes so much more real. And whether we're talking about refugees who have been through trauma or workplace employees who are experiencing burnout, elevating their firsthand recounts of their lived experiences creates empathy and motivates us to learn more, maybe to help more. It also gives those who are often without a voice a chance to have one. And that's very empowering. All right, so now I've made the case, I hope, for qualitative interviews. Now we're going to talk about some of the brass tacks, okay? And the critical one, and if you're in the doctoral program and you're starting to work on your research study, is alignment. You're going to hear about this from your professors. Let's talk about alignment. A well-executed qualitative study, and that means a well-executed interview, if that's the kind of data collection you choose, depends on alignment between all of its components. This ensures that every part of your research, from the questions you ask to the findings you present, works together to create a coherent, credible study. And here's how it all connects. It's like a roadmap, okay? You start with the purpose statement. You've identified a problem and you want to address it in your study. So you create a purpose statement of what you're going to do, what your study is about. It's where your roadmap begins, and it's going to determine what research questions you develop, your methodology, and your analysis. And then you get to your research questions, okay? Everything evolves from here. These are what you, the researcher, want to uncover in your study. Do not confuse these with your interview questions. Your RQs should be clearly defined and guide the entire study. And then we have the literature review. Your lit review provides the theoretical and empirical foundation for your study, and it helps justify why do it in the first place. It justifies why your research questions are important, and it helps you figure out what hasn't been researched, because that's what you need to study. Then we look at the interview guide. All right. The interview guide are your questions that should be directly derived from your research questions and informed by your lit review. Are you seeing how all of this is connecting? How all of this is coming together? So this ensures you're collecting data that speaks to the core issues of your study. Next is the interview itself. During the interview, your data collection process should stay true to your research objectives while allowing participants the flexibility to share their stories in their own words. And we're going to talk about having some flexibility in this in a minute. Finally is data analysis. Once interviews are conducted, the data analysis allows you to identify patterns and themes and insights, and your analysis should be methodologically sound so that your findings answer your original research question. So it's all connected, okay? It ties directly back to the lit review. It confirms existing theories or not, challenges them, or contributes new insights. If any part of this process is misaligned, if your interview guide doesn't match your research questions, or if your findings don't connect back to the literature, then the study loses its credibility. So let's figure out how we do that. So to effectively tap into the motivations and experiences of participants, we need what we call an interview guide, a well-crafted one. And think of this as your roadmap for a successful qualitative interview. It provides a structure to ensure that we gather the necessary data while allowing for enough flexibility and exploration to capture unexpected insights. And there will be unexpected insights in a qualitative research study, most likely. The first step in creating an interview guide is to outline the main topics that will help you answer your research questions. Don't forget that. Just really hone in on those RQs. These topics should align with your RQs, the themes from your lit review, and your theoretical framework. They should be broad enough to encourage rich discussion. And I'm going to show you exactly how this works at the end. Once the key topics are established, the next step is to develop some initial open-ended questions that invite participants to share their responses and their perspectives. It's their experiences in their own words. And the goal is to capture their unique perspective, their individual way of making meaning. Instead of asking direct, closed-ended questions, use exploratory prompts such as tell me about, and this encourages storytelling and reflection, or describe a time when, allows participants to paint a vivid picture of their experiences. What was it like when, invites them to share emotions and thoughts and interpretations. So these open-ended questions ensure that the conversation remains participant-driven rather than based on what we, the researcher, may perceive going in. And we're going to have a lot of perceptions going into this interview, right? We've done our lit review. We probably studied this topic for a year before we actually sat down and talked with our participants. We've got some preconceived notions on our hands. And guess what? That doesn't matter in the interview. You need to let the participant share their truth and their reality. That's what the whole purpose of this is, okay? It allows them to take the discussion in directions that may reveal entirely new insights beyond what you initially anticipated. I know in my own study, I had findings that had not been revealed in other studies that I had read extensively. So it was exciting. But if I hadn't been open to hearing that, I might have overlooked those things. So unlike closed-ended questions, open-ended questions don't presume an answer ahead of time. They don't presume what the answer is. They don't presume a correct answer. Instead, they allow the participant's perspective to emerge naturally. So once we've outlined the broad topics and developed some open-ended questions, the next step is refining specific questions that ensure we collect rich, structured, and comparable data across participants. So usually what we do in qualitative interviews are what we call semi-structured interviews. And these questions ensure that all participants address key areas of interest while still having the freedom to shape their responses, okay? So you wanna vary the types of questions you ask in your interview guide so that you can kind of come at the phenomenon you're trying to uncover from a couple of different angles. So you can ask experience-based questions like, can you walk me through a typical day at work? These elicit some detailed descriptions of lived experiences. And I find that specificity is easier for people to handle than like, tell me what it's like to work where you work. You know, if you can ask for like a typical day, that gives them something to kind of, to latch onto. Opinion-based questions. What do you think about the way leadership communicates at your company? So these uncover personal viewpoints. Feeling-based questions. How did you feel when that happened? So these provide insight into emotional responses. Knowledge-based questions. What do you know about the policies in place to support employees? And something, this helps us understand where the employee is in their own edification and their own knowledge of their surroundings, okay? It assesses their understanding. Sensory detail questions. What do you remember seeing or hearing in that moment? Demographic questions. What is your job title and how long have you worked in this field? So these demographic questions, they provide context, and sometimes we ask them even before we choose our participants. Like we might weed out participants with some demographic questions, and they may not actually be part of our official data collection because it's just used to kind of determine who's going to be in our study or not. But beyond that, I've also used demographic questions in interviews before. I might use it as an opening question sometimes just to build rapport. Like, can you walk me through your career? How did you get to where you are today? Something like that. Beyond these, we can also use specialized questions to push the conversation deeper. Hypothetical questions I love, especially if we're trying to give participants a voice. If you could redesign the system, how would you do it? It captures their imagination. So many times participants that we're working with have never been asked this question. I'm an educator. I've read a lot of educational research, and I've seen the impact of policies that were created without teachers ever having been asked if the policies would be effective in the classroom. So it's a simple thing of asking your participants, what would you like to see have done? Okay. There's also devil's advocate questions. Some might argue that this issue isn't a big problem. How would you respond to that? This prompts participants to defend or reconsider their perspectives. Ideal position questions, similar to the hypothetical. What would a perfect solution look like in your opinion? These reveal aspirations and expectations. And then there's interpretive questions. What do you think this experience says about workplace culture? So these encourage participants to reflect on the meaning of something that's happened. But now I want to look at how to create your questions. All right. So, like, what to avoid. We're going to work through some good versus bad, I should say bad versus good questions. Okay. Remember, like I said, in a qualitative interview, the participant's in the driver's seat. It's their reality, their truth, not ours. Our role as a researcher is not to convince, correct, or teach. Our goal is to listen deeply and ask thoughtful questions. So we need to resist the urge to lead. I've worked with a lot of doctoral students, and I remember clearly I had a client who, when the state of Colorado passed the law allowing recreational marijuana. They were one of the first in the country. He was, he was a business student and he was completely opposed to it. And his research study was going to be on, why this was bad for business. And so I met with him at the point, I wasn't with him at the university, but I met with him at the point where he was getting ready to conduct his interviews. And his interview questions were like, tell me why this is bad. Tell me how poorly your employees are acting on the job as a result of the legalization of marijuana. And I'm trying to explain to him, that's a leading question because it may not be bad for them. There could be many reasons why it's not bad for them. One is they don't partake. All right. Or they don't work with people who do partake, or maybe they partake and it's not bad for them. So there are lots of, things that we have to consider. So we need to get rid of the leading questions. So if we look at our example, in what ways are the new company policies unfair? Right. Clearly, that's a leading question. Maybe they're not unfair. So we would need to reword that to, how do you feel about the new company policies? Maybe they feel great about them. Maybe they don't like them at all. Maybe they are completely ambivalent. Then we have closed-ended questions. And these are really easy to spot once you learn about them, okay? Closed-ended questions, the answer is yes or no. And you want to avoid those. No closed-ended questions if you can help it, okay? Do you like your job? Yes or no. Then what do you do, right? Like it's a dead end question. So rephrase it. How do you feel about your job? And maybe follow it up with, what do you enjoy or find challenging about it? Another one is multiple questions at once. What do you think of your supervisor and how do they support your team? So we've got two questions at the same time, and we've also got a leading question, right? How do they support your team? Maybe they don't support the team. So we need to split this up and get rid of the leading question. Describe, if you can, a typical day's experience in working with your supervisor. In what ways, if any, do you feel supported by them? Then there are what I call jargony questions. Jargony is not a word, but jargon is. Jargony questions are really easy to create once you are super grounded in the literature and you know all the terms being thrown around and you know all the jargon being used in your field, and you create your interview question and all the questions have these big, big words, and you read them off to your participant and their eyes glaze over because they don't get it, right? They're not doctoral students. So you would say, the jargony question is, in what ways does your lived experience align with the hegemonic structures embedded in your workplace's organizational culture? Whew, that's a lot. Let's just reword that. Describe, if you can, your experience of working at your company. That's a little vague, so maybe we might follow that up with a probing question. What workplace norms or expectations, if they exist, influence how you do your job? That might even be a little too complicated. Okay, so sometimes you just need to step back from the question and tell the participant what you're trying to ask. Okay. So a well-structured interview should follow a logical sequence that encourages a natural flow and a good pace. Remember, it's a conversation. You're having a conversation with somebody who's agreed to take an hour out of their day to meet with you. So give them a chance and give them the space to give you their answers. Okay? This isn't a game of 20 questions. This is you having a conversation, and the interview guide is there to make sure you hit all your questions, but it doesn't always unfold that way. Okay? So let me explain. You're going to begin with general lower stakes questions that help build rapport and allow the participant to sort of ease into the conversation. What has been your experience in working in this field? Okay, so they can answer that question. That's their personal experience. What challenges have you encountered in your role? And then toward the end of your interview, you might introduce more sensitive or reflective questions once trust has been established. Like, what impact, if any, have these challenges had on your personal and professional growth? So this approach minimizes discomfort because you're building that trust early on. You're giving them easier questions to answer at the start, and it ensures a more natural, open conversation. Don't be afraid to dig deeper, though. Remember, it's a conversation. You're going to ask follow-up questions. Okay, so even with well-crafted questions, some responses that you get back are going to lack depth, or they're going to need clarification. And this is where probing questions become essential. So for clarity, you might say, when you say the work culture was difficult, can you describe what you mean by that? Or a detail-oriented probe. Can you walk me through what happened on a typical day? Or an example-seeking probe. You mentioned feeling unsupported. Can you share a specific moment that made you feel that way? These are the kind of details that are going to look really wonderful in your dissertation or your research study. Those little vignettes, those little glimpses into the day in the life of, can be very powerful in a research study. So while it's helpful to anticipate potential probing questions, and your professor might even, or your dissertation chair might even ask you to write some probing questions out ahead of time, they should largely emerge naturally based on the participant responses. So they say something and maybe you want clarification, and that probing question isn't written down in your interview guide, but you want more information, so you ask it. The key is active listening, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a minute, but you're going to pay attention to gaps or vague responses or emotional cues so that you can ask the right follow-up questions at the right time. You can also do something like the 3-interview structure. So Irving Seidman, in his book, Interviewing as Qualitative Research, which was my Bible in writing my dissertation, he outlines a structured 3-interview approach that emphasizes understanding participants' experiences, meaning making through storytelling, and maintaining depth and context. So these types of interviews can be conducted in many ways. He advocates 3 interviews. The first interview is maybe the background, their life history, their context. This stage sets the foundation for, the whole interview. For example, can you tell me about your early experiences with leadership in your career? The second interview focuses on the specific topic. Here, the conversation might shift toward the central research topic, allowing the participant to reflect deeply on their experiences and their beliefs and their perspectives. And this is really where these rich, detailed narratives emerge, providing insights into how the participant interprets their experiences. An example of this: can you describe a specific time when you felt challenged as a leader? And then the third interview is reflection and meaning making. In this final stage, participants are encouraged to step back and reflect on the larger significance of their experiences. So an example might be, looking back, how have your leadership experiences shaped the way you approach challenges today? So the structure works because it builds trust. It starts with their personal history, gets them comfortable, and it dives into the core topic, and then it allows for deeper reflection. It prevents shallow data collection, which is very easy to do if you don't have a well-written interview guide based on your literature and your research questions. Okay, you need to really be thinking about what kind of responses you want to get back, not necessarily what they say, but the depth, and consider, what probing questions might be relevant to include. Now, it's also important to say not all studies need a 3-interview structure. Okay, it depends on your purpose statement and your research questions and who your participants will be. In my case, I was interviewing refugees who had been through war and trauma and migration, and I definitely needed more than one interview to get at the core of the phenomenon I was studying. So now we want to talk about piloting that interview. You've got the interview guide. Now you're going to take it for a test drive. So before conducting your main interviews, you want to pilot test your interview guide. Think of it as piloting as a test drive before hitting the road. It helps you ensure that everything is running smoothly before you fully commit to your study. So it allows you to refine your language. Some questions may sound clear to you, but may be confusing for the participants. Remember, it goes back to maybe our questions have too much jargon in them, and the participant doesn't really understand what you're asking them. So piloting helps you identify phrasing that might need to be adjusted. It helps you ensure clarity. If your participants are struggling to answer a question, or if they're asking for a lot of clarification, that's a sign it may need to be reworded. A pilot test can also help you uncover unexpected issues. Sometimes an interview question leads the conversation in an unintended direction. Excuse me. Or participants misunderstand the intent of the question. This is especially true if you're dealing cross-culturally. So a pilot study helps catch these issues early. One way to do this, and this is what I did, is to recruit a few more participants than you need, and then pull out 2 to be your pilot testers. And this is effective because they've qualified for your study. They share the experiences you're hoping to learn more about, and thus the reactions they have to your questions will feel more real and help you get a better understanding of how you might need to modify your interview guide. Their data doesn't get incorporated into your data that you collect for your study. It's merely an opportunity for you to test run those questions. And then this is just a reminder not to get lost in Meville, which is it's not about you and what you expect and what you want the participants to say. Okay, it's like my former client who wanted participants to talk about how bad the legalization of marijuana was for businesses in Colorado. It's not about what you believe necessarily, okay? The role of the researcher is to listen, not to lead. So stay open, stay neutral, and let participants express what's most important. Now, I said I was going to get back to active listening, and this is one of the most important skills in qualitative interviewing. This is where you absorb the participant's message and you respond in a way that shows you understand and value their perspective, and creating a space for them to fully express themselves. It builds trust, it leads to richer data, it ensures meaningful conversation. So use nonverbal cues, nod, maintain eye contact, use facial expressions to show you're engaged. Pause and reflect. So what I hear you saying is, or I'm not quite sure I get this right. Can you explain further what X, Y, or Z means? Also, be comfortable with silence. Don't rush to fill pauses. Let participants gather their thoughts. That's when you get some of the most rich data that you can. And avoid interrupting, and definitely don't anticipate responses. Let them finish their thoughts before moving to the next question. You'll know when you've been actively listening when you're completely drained after conducting an interview. If you're listening this way, it's very difficult to take notes, I found. I've worked with dissertation writers who have indicated that during the interview, they plan to observe the participant and take notes on these observations to use as another type of data collection, like taking notes actively during the interview, like, just their nonverbal cues and their reactions and things. And I have a very hard time doing this myself. Everyone's different, but for me, active listening and considering what probing questions I need to create means that I really can't do anything else. So just take that for what you will. It's not a map. It's a map. It's not a GPS. So a common misconception about interview guides is that they're engraved in stone, right? That they're strict scripts that must be followed in a set order. In reality, qualitative interviews are dynamic. Again, they're a conversation. And the guide should serve as a flexible tool rather than a rigid checklist, going from 1 to 20, and I can't go out of order. Most qualitative interviews are semi-structured, meaning that they allow for flexibility in wording, in order, and in asking those follow-up questions that I mentioned. So the point of the guide is not necessarily that you start with 1 and finish with, I'm just saying 20 for easy math, but not necessarily that you start with 1 and end with 20. I mean, yes, you want to start with the easier questions and move into the harder ones. It's not meant to necessarily be word for word. You want to make sure that you get the questions across, but flexibility is really essential here. And this is the number one reason why. Participants may answer multiple questions at once. Because people are complex thinkers and they're human beings, they're going to answer your question and probably answer, they're going to answer question number 2 and maybe 7 and 9 at the same time because they're telling a story, right? They often provide rich, interconnected answers that naturally touch on multiple topics. So this means jumping ahead in your guide rather than rigidly sticking to your list. Building rapport also doesn't begin when the interview starts. Building rapport with your participant begins before the interview. You set clear expectations ahead of time with an email or a phone call. You're going to reach out to the participant to explain what to expect, how long you anticipate the interview to take, maybe the themes or the questions you're going to ask, explain that you would like to record the interview, ask if they have any concerns or preferences to ensure that they feel at ease. You're going to explain the interview setting so that they know what to expect. Like, we'll meet at a quiet conference room at the library to ensure privacy and no distractions. If you're doing a virtual interview, which has become so much the norm now after COVID, then you want to ensure that they understand the technology, right? So your email or contact beforehand is essential because you don't want to get to the interview and they don't know how to use Zoom. Excuse me, I apologize. I have a little bit of a cold. And remember that ideally interviews should take place away from work or school to ensure participants feel free to speak openly without fear of being identified as part of a particular study. So whenever possible, allow them to choose where they feel most comfortable. You want to reassure them about confidentiality. They might worry about who will have access to the responses, how their recordings are going to be used, if their boss is going to find out. Hold on just a second. So you want to clarify, you want to obviously go over the informed consent procedures with them and just assure them of their confidentiality. Greet them warmly when they come in or when they're on the camera for the first time. They're taking time out of their day. So, make sure that you start building that rapport right away with a warm greeting. And then respect their boundaries. If they don't want to answer a question, just move on. Don't make a deal out of it, obviously. I'm so sorry. Okay, recording qualitative interviews is essential for ensuring accuracy. Capturing the full depth of participant responses and allowing for thorough analysis. So recording matters because you want to have reliability and accuracy. Recording them ensures that you capture exactly what they say rather than relying on your memory or handwritten notes. Having said that, I've conducted research studies where we've done exactly that. So both are possible. And then you want to have a transcription. The recording of the interview will allow for transcription. So once the interview is recorded, the transcription helps you identify those themes and patterns and key insights. You have to obtain consent to record, though. Before recording, you have to they have to explicitly agree to be recorded. It should probably be part of your informed consent procedures, your formal informed consent procedures. But what if they decide they don't want to be recorded, right? That's a decision it's a conversation you need to have with your chair ahead of time. Will it mess up your study tremendously if you don't get to record a specific participant? I had to take notes on one of my participants in my dissertation, and it was very, very difficult. So I'm of the mind that it's really best to record. But again, that's something that you want to talk about with your research committee. And then transcribe promptly. Recording interviews is just the first step. But if you want to transcribe the process early. You want to transcribe the interviews pretty early because you want to capture and remember those key moments, those emotions, those nonverbal cues. Maybe you didn't capture them effectively during the interview because you were so intently listening, right? But hearing their voices again may remind you, oh yeah, they were really impacted when they explained this particular experience. It must have been very important to them. It also helps you start identifying analytical structures early in making the next phases of research more efficient. You're going to start realizing that, oh, my participants are kind of saying the same things, here. So I'm really seeing these trends and these themes emerge very early on. It also keeps participants' words fresh in your mind. So the more you engage with the transcripts, the more familiar you become with your participants' voices and themes and lived experiences. However, it's super time consuming if you're doing it manually. Almost everybody nowadays does AI transcription. I will say that Zoom's transcription is horrible, and you will likely spend more time fixing the transcription than you would just doing it yourself. But something like Descript or even Fireflies are both excellent. So there are so many options out there. If your participants have heavy accents, or if you are interviewing them in a loud and noisy place, transcription gets a lot more difficult and you may have to manually transcribe those. So just know, regardless of whether you use manual or AI transcription, you have to go through those transcripts at least twice once they're done and compare them to the recording so that you know that they're accurate. And remember that as the researcher, you yourself influence the data. You're not simply collecting the data, you're co-creating it between the researcher and the participant. Unlike quantitative data where it exists independently of us, qualitative data emerges through our conversation, our interaction. So your background, your knowledge, your relationship with the participant, if you have one, that's all going to shape the interview. If you share a common background with them, if you worked at the place that they worked at, and that impacts, that might impact the data collection process. You have to be reflexive about your role and your biases. You come in with, everybody has biases. It's okay. We're human beings. We should have biases, right? But we need to acknowledge them. We need to maybe keep a journal of our biases to remind ourselves how we reacted when a participant said a certain thing, and just make note of that. So there are ways that we can bracket our biases. So like I said, maintain a reflexive journal, consciously set aside your preconceived ideas to remain as open as possible. and revisit the transcripts as objectively as possible. You can also have like an expert in your field review your findings to ensure that what you took from the transcripts is an accurate reflection of the themes that were in the transcripts themselves. So that's, you can also do member checking. We ask the participants themselves to look at the themes that we've captured and say, this is how I see, the data that I've collected from you. Help me come to the conclusion on several themes here. I would like your input on this, right? Now, finally, as I am wrapping up, I wanted to show you some of the specific, 3 specific things that I recommend for creating your interview guide and what it actually looks like. This is how to organize your interview guide to make your data analysis easier later on and making sure that everything is aligned. And it also has the added benefit that it's when you're said and done, that your study fits squarely within the body of literature and it addresses a specific gap. So in this first table, I've got 2 columns. On the left, I've got my research questions. Okay, on workplace burnout. This is our mythical study, right? 2 research questions related to workplace burnout. And then in the right column, I've got my interview questions. Every interview question should align directly with one of your research questions. Okay. This does not mean that I have to read off these interview questions in order. I can still move around this interview guide if my participant answers a question I haven't asked yet. But it does show that my interview questions are aligned to my RQs. And it ensures that the data I collect is also going to be aligned to those RQs. So it just makes it all come together so nicely. Another step you can take is to add your theoretical framework to this alignment. Every research study should be, most likely is, underpinned with a theoretical or conceptual framework. In this case, my fictional study on workplace burnout uses a theory that's real, and it's called the Jobs Demand Resources model. Now, this Jobs Demand Resources, or JDR model, is a theory that explains how job demands and resources affect employee well-being. And the model suggests that job demands can lead to burnout, while job resources can lead to engagement. So within this model, there are 4 constructs or variables that I'm using to frame my study. And you can see them on the left: job demands, job resources, burnout, and work engagement. And I want to align these 4 constructs to my RQs and my interview questions so that I know that everything is in perfect alignment. Thus, the data I collect is aligned to the 4 constructs. It's aligned to the research questions, okay? The last table is I show how my interview questions link back to the literature review I've conducted. So every interview question should ideally be derived from something you read in your lit review. This is why I find it critical to do the lit review first before creating the interview guide. As you read through a research study and write about it in your lit review, what questions come to mind that you think, gosh, I really should ask my participants about that? When you have those light bulb moments, write those questions down in your journal, in your research journal. Because when you get done with your lit review, then you're going to have dozens of questions to pull from your interview guide. You're not going to use all of them. But when you pull your questions after doing your lit review, that means your questions are directly connected to your lit review. Okay? So anyway, on this table, you can see how I've listed the interview question on the left and then why the question was included on the right. It's the justification, citing the source or sources that connect to them. This helps you so much in chapter 5. Okay, I'm just telling you now. Now, just to look at an artifact from times past, this was my interview guide. This is just a screenshot of part of it. And you can see that I've got citations after my questions, and I've got probing questions underneath. And I've got, the top is the end part of my first interview, and the bottom is the beginning of my second interview. But I've got citations there indicating where the idea came to ask that interview question. All right. So when you connect these things together, it makes your data analysis so much easier and so much more credible. Finally, when you're done with your interviews and you've transcribed them, then you begin your data analysis, but that's a topic for another day. If you've done what I've suggested in this presentation, you'll have a much, much easier time analyzing your results, how they connect to your theoretical framework, your research questions, your lit review, and ultimately to the purpose of your study. Enjoy the journey. So that's it. I know that's a lot. What questions do you all have today? I don't know if anybody can ask questions. You're all muted.
Right. If they can't ask, you can type it in the question and answer area. I'm not sure if you're able to unmute.
Oh,
We'll give
okay.
you a moment if you have any questions. This was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
You're getting some messages of thanks.
Oh, well, thank you. Glad to have you here.
And I think what I'm going to do is I am going to turn the recording off, and you can hang out for a moment if there
Sure.
are any questions. And this was truly, it was extremely interesting, and it's going to be very helpful. And I'm sure there will be many people who will enjoy this recording and benefit from this.
Great.
So I'm very grateful and for your time and for the care you took in this presentation. And it was really, really great. Thank you so much, Dr.
You're
Russ.
so welcome. You're so welcome. I'm so glad to be here. And please remember, I'm just an email away. I'm at Keiser. So if anybody has any questions that they want to follow up with me on, I can put my email in here.
Great.
Thank
Right.
you, Dr. Budenmuller. I appreciate your kind words. I hope I said your name right.